On July 10, 1942, Lieutenant William Thies was lost over the Aleutian Islands. His PBY Catalina patrol plane had been navigating by dead reckoning through thick fog, and somewhere over the endless Alaskan waters, he'd drifted off course. When the Shumagan Islands appeared through a break in the clouds, Thies reoriented and turned toward the most direct route back to Dutch Harbor. That route took him over Akutan Island, a desolate volcanic rock covered in muskeg swamp that nobody ever flew over. Then his plane captain, Albert Knack, spotted something impossible below. An aircraft, belly up in the swamp. The distinctive lines of a Japanese Zero fighter. Thies banked the PBY into a tight circle. From 500 feet, he could see the aircraft was intact. Not destroyed, not burned, just sitting inverted in the marsh like someone had carefully placed it there. The red Hinomaru roundels on the wings were clearly visible. This was the aircraft that had dominated Pacific skies for 8 months. The fighter American pilots called unbeatable. Thies marked the position on his map and headed back to Dutch Harbor. He knew what he'd found. Inside that crashed fighter was the answer to why American pilots kept dying. The secret to understanding how the Zero turned, how it climbed, where it was vulnerable. But first, he'd have to convince his commanding officer that a wrecked enemy fighter in a remote swamp was worth the enormous effort to recover. He'd have to organize one of the most important salvage operations of World War II. And he'd have to do it before the Japanese realized what they'd left behind. What Thies didn't know was that the Japanese pilot who'd made that landing had executed it perfectly, and that perfect emergency landing would kill more Japanese pilots than any single American ace. Before we continue, I'd love to know if you've ever heard this story. Drop a comment below and let me know where you're watching from, and if this story is new to you. And if you're enjoying these deep dives into aviation history that changed everything, hit that subscribe button so you don't miss the next one. These stories take serious research to get every detail right, and knowing you're out there makes it worthwhile. To understand why one crashed Zero mattered so much, you need to understand the situation American pilots faced in mid-1942. Since Pearl Harbor, Japanese Zero fighters had shot down American aircraft at a ratio of roughly 3-to-1, sometimes worse. The Zero could turn inside anything the United States flew. It could climb faster than American fighters. It was more maneuverable at every altitude. American pilots knew the Zero was dangerous, but they didn't know why. They didn't know the Zero had no armor plating. They didn't know its fuel tanks weren't self-sealing. They didn't know that above 230 miles per hour, the Zero's ailerons became so stiff that pilots could barely roll the aircraft. They just knew that when they got into a turning fight with a Zero, they died. Squadron after squadron learned this the hard way. Get into a dogfight. Try to outturn the Zero. Watch the tracers coming at you. Never make it home. The Navy needed answers. They needed to understand this aircraft. They needed to know how to kill it. And in June 1942, a Japanese pilot named Tadayoshi Koga was about to give them exactly what they needed. June 4th, 1942. While the Battle of Midway raged 1,200 miles to the south, Petty Officer Tadayoshi Koga prepared for what should have been a routine mission. Koga was an experienced pilot assigned to the aircraft carrier Ryujo. His mission was part of a diversionary attack on Dutch Harbor, a U.S. Navy installation in Alaska's Aleutian Islands. While American attention focused on Midway, Japanese forces would strike Alaska, potentially opening a northern invasion route. Koga flew an A6M2 Model 21-0, one of 19 fighters escorting bombers to Dutch harbor. The attack went well. Japanese bombers hit fuel tanks and military installations. American anti-aircraft fire was heavy, but largely ineffective. Then, Koga's luck changed. A single bullet from a ground-based machine gun struck his aircraft. Not a catastrophic hit, just one round that punched through the fuselage and severed a return oil line from his Nakajima Sake engine. The engine didn't explode. It didn't seize immediately. It just started losing oil pressure, which meant it would fail soon. Koga couldn't make it back to the Ryujo. He needed to land immediately. He spotted what looked like a flat, grassy area on nearby Akutan Island. Emergency landing protocols were clear. He should ditch in the ocean where rescue was possible, but the island looked better. Soft ground, no trees visible. He made his choice. Koga lined up his approach, dropped his Zero toward the green meadow, kept his speed steady. Every pilot trains for emergency landings. Lower the gear, cut the engine at the last moment. Let the aircraft settle onto the grass. Except it wasn't grass, it was muskeg, thick, waterlogged swamp vegetation covering deep mud. The kind of terrain that looks solid from the air but has the consistency of wet sponge. Koga's Zero touched down on what should have been solid ground. Instead, the landing gear immediately sank into the soft muskeg. The deceleration was instantaneous and violent. The nose pitched forward. The tail lifted. For a moment, the Zero balanced on its propeller and landing gear, suspended at an impossible angle. Then physics took over. The aircraft flipped, completely inverted. The canopy drove into the soft ground. The tail rose into the air, then settled back down with the Zero resting upside down in the swamp. The whole sequence took perhaps 3 seconds. Tadayoshi Koga died on impact. Medical examiners would later determine his neck broke from the sudden deceleration. Death was instantaneous. He never knew that his final flight would change the course of the Pacific War. But here's what made this crash extraordinary. The Zero remained almost completely intact. The soft muskeg cushioned the impact. The fuselage didn't crumple. The wings didn't tear off. Even the tail section stayed attached. The aircraft sat upside down, perfectly preserved, in one of the most remote locations in North America. Japanese search aircraft flew over the area repeatedly in the following days. They spotted Koga's Zero from the air, recognized it was wrecked, and reported it destroyed. They never sent a ground team. They never verified its condition. They assumed, reasonably, that an upside-down aircraft in an Alaskan swamp wasn't worth recovering. The Zero sat there for 5 weeks. Rain fell. Fog rolled in. The aircraft settled deeper into the muskeg. No one touched it. No one examined it. One of Japan's most advanced weapons lay abandoned in enemy territory, and neither side knew what they had. When Thies landed at Dutch harbor and reported what he'd found, his commanding officer, Lieutenant Commander Paul Foley, was skeptical. A Japanese Zero, intact, in an Alaskan swamp? It sounded too good to be true. "How intact?" Foley asked. Thies described what he'd seen. Upside down, but the fuselage appeared solid. Wings attached. No fire damage. From the air, it looked recoverable. Foley knew what this could mean. American pilots were dying because they didn't understand the Zero. Engineers had never examined one intact. Intelligence officers had never studied its construction in detail. But recovery would be difficult. Akutan Island was remote. The terrain was impossible. It would take weeks of work for uncertain results. Thies made his case. He'd seen enough from the air to know this wasn't ordinary wreckage. This was a complete aircraft, preserved by soft ground. If they could recover it, they could test it. They could learn its weaknesses. They could save American lives. Foley authorized the mission. The next day, July 11th, Thies flew back to Akutan with a salvage team and Navy photographer's mate, Arthur Baumann. When they reached the crash site on foot, trudging through the muskeg, Thies's assessment proved correct. The Zero was upside down with its canopy buried in mud. The wings showed bullet holes from the Dutch harbor attack, but the structure was sound. The engine looked undamaged. The control surfaces were intact. This wasn't just recoverable. This was flyable if they could get it out of the swamp and repair the damage. They found Koga's body still in the cockpit. His neck had broken from the impact. They removed him carefully and buried him on Akutan Island with military honors. Even in death, even though he was an enemy, he'd died serving his country. They could respect that. Then came the hard part. The Zero weighed over 5,000 pounds. It sat in terrain that could barely support a man's weight, much less heavy equipment. The nearest road was miles away. They would have to build access routes, construct work platforms, and somehow flip the aircraft without destroying it. The recovery operation took 3 weeks. Navy construction crews built roads through the swamp using logs and gravel. They erected platforms around the Zero to distribute weight. They carefully excavated the buried canopy section. They built wooden cradles to support the fuselage during the flip. On August 12th, they finally had the Zero secured, righted, and ready for transport. They loaded it onto a barge, shipped it to Dutch Harbor, then to Seattle, and finally sent it by rail to Naval Air Station San Diego. By September, the Zero that Koga had crashed on a remote Alaskan island sat in a California hangar, about to reveal every secret that had made it unbeatable. Lieutenant Commander Eddie Sanders walked around the Zero for the 10th time that morning. As the Navy's chief test pilot at San Diego, he'd flown dozens of aircraft types, but he'd never expected to fly an enemy fighter. The restoration team had done remarkable work. They'd cleaned the mud from the engine, replaced damaged hydraulic lines, repaired the landing gear that had collapsed in the muskeg. The Zero looked almost factory fresh, painted in its original green camouflage with the red Hinomaru roundels still visible on the wings. On September 20th, 1942, Sanders climbed into the cockpit for the first test flight. The canopy slid forward. The Nakajima engine caught and roared to life. He taxied to the runway, advanced the throttle, and lifted the most intact enemy fighter in American possession into California skies. What Sanders discovered in the next 30 minutes would change everything American pilots thought they knew about fighting the Zero. The aircraft was extraordinary in some ways. At low speed, it turned incredibly tight. The climb rate was phenomenal. At certain altitudes, it could climb almost vertically. The visibility from the cockpit was excellent. Sanders could see in nearly every direction. But then, he pushed the Zero faster. Above 230 miles per hour, something changed. The control stick became harder to move. The ailerons, which controlled roll, required enormous force. At 250 miles per hour, Sanders could barely roll the aircraft at all. The Zero's legendary maneuverability vanished at high speed. He pushed into a dive. The Zero accelerated quickly, but as speed increased past 300 miles per hour, the controls became dangerously stiff. The aircraft wanted to pull itself into a tighter and tighter spiral. Sanders had to use both hands on the stick to prevent the Zero from rolling inverted. Recovering from high-speed dives was nearly impossible. Then Sanders fired the guns. The Zero carried two 7.7mm machine guns and two 20mm cannons. Impressive armament. But Sanders immediately noticed something critical. There was no armor plating protecting the pilot. The seat was unprotected. A single bullet hitting the cockpit would kill the pilot instantly. He examined the fuel tanks. They weren't self-sealing. American aircraft had rubber-lined fuel tanks that would seal themselves if punctured. The Zero's tanks were plain aluminum. One tracer round through a fuel tank, and the entire aircraft would become a fireball. Sanders landed after 40 minutes of flight testing. He'd discovered the Zero's greatest weaknesses. The information he'd gathered would save hundreds of American lives. The Navy immediately classified Sanders's findings as top secret and began distributing tactical bulletins to every fighter squadron in the Pacific. The information was simple. Never dogfight with a Zero. Never try to outturn it at low speed. Use speed and altitude. Dive in, shoot, climb away. The new tactics worked. American pilots who followed the guidelines started surviving their encounters. Kill ratios began to improve. The Zero was still dangerous, but it was no longer invincible. But here's what nobody anticipated. The captured Zero created a deadly new problem. American pilots started getting overconfident. They knew the Zero couldn't roll at high speed. They knew one tracer through the fuel tank meant certain destruction. They knew the pilot had no armor protection. So they started pressing attacks too long, getting too close, taking risks they never would have taken before. In October 1942, 3 American pilots died in a single week because they followed a damaged Zero down through clouds, certain they had an easy kill. The Zero pilot, knowing exactly what Americans now expected, reversed hard at low altitude. All 3 American aircraft, traveling too fast to turn with the Zero, overshot and were shot down. Japanese pilots noticed something had changed. American tactics shifted suddenly in September 1942. Instead of trying to dogfight, American pilots began using pure energy tactics. Dive attacks, high-speed passes, zoom climbs. They stopped playing to the Zero's strengths, but Japanese pilots also noticed American overconfidence. They started using the Zero's remaining advantages more aggressively. Extreme low-speed maneuvering, unexpected reversals. Exploiting the brief moments when American pilots assumed victory was certain. The Navy realized they'd created a training problem. It wasn't enough to tell pilots about the Zero's weaknesses. They needed to show them. They needed pilots to experience firsthand what the Zero could and couldn't do. So they did something unprecedented. They began flying the captured Zero in mock combat against American fighters. Squadron after squadron sent their best pilots to San Diego to dogfight against the real thing. Not a simulation, not a description, the actual aircraft. Pilots learned the hard way that knowing the Zero's weaknesses didn't mean the fight was easy. They learned respect for the aircraft. They learned exactly when they could push and when they needed to break off. They learned that the Zero was beatable, but only if you fought it correctly. The impact of the captured Zero on Pacific air combat was immediate and dramatic. Within 3 months of the test flight's beginning, American kill ratios against Japanese fighters improved from 3-to-1 in Japan's favor to nearly even. By mid-1943, American pilots were shooting down Japanese aircraft at rates of 10-to-1. The tactics developed from studying Koga's Zero became standard doctrine. The Thak weave, a defensive formation that used mutual support to counter the Zero's turning advantage, was validated through mock combat against the captured aircraft. Boom and zoom tactics, using American aircraft's superior speed and diving performance, became the standard approach. New aircraft designs incorporated lessons learned from the Zero. When Grumman designed the F-6F Hellcat, they specifically addressed the Zero's strengths. The Hellcat had armor protection, self-sealing fuel tanks, and could roll quickly at high speed. It could absorb damage that would destroy a Zero. And it could dive away from any fight, and the Zero couldn't follow. The Hellcat's combat record against the Zero was devastating. In its first major engagement, Hellcats shot down 30 Japanese aircraft without a single American loss. The ratio continued. By the end of the war, Hellcats had destroyed over 5,000 Japanese aircraft with a kill ratio of 19-1. Japanese commanders noticed the shift, but couldn't understand what had changed. American pilots suddenly seemed to know exactly how to fight the Zero. They exploited every weakness. They avoided every strength. It was as if the Americans had been given a manual on how to kill the Zero. In a sense, they had. The Navy's tactical bulletins, based entirely on testing Koga's Zero, were exactly that. A detailed instruction manual on destroying Japan's primary fighter. Japanese intelligence investigated. They questioned captured American pilots. They examined shot-down American aircraft for new equipment. They analyzed combat reports for patterns. They never discovered the Americans had an intact Zero. They never realized that every tactical advantage they'd enjoyed from 1941 to mid-1942 had been systematically analyzed and countered. The captured Zero flew for over a year, accumulating hundreds of test flight hours. Dozens of pilots flew it. Engineers took it apart and measured every component. Metallurgists analyzed its construction. Intelligence officers photographed every detail. On February 15, 1945, the Zero's test flight career ended. Flying near San Diego, the Nakajima engine finally failed. The pilot made an emergency landing, but the aircraft was too damaged to repair. It had served its purpose. The information it provided had already changed the Pacific Air War. Tadayoshi Koga's body was recovered from the Zero's cockpit during the initial salvage operation in July 1942. He was buried with military honors on Akutan Island, in recognition that even though he was an enemy, he'd died in combat, serving his country. His family in Japan knew only that he'd been shot down during the Aleutian campaign. They didn't know where. They didn't know his aircraft had been captured. For decades after the war, Koga's relatives had no details about his final mission or burial location. In the 1970s, American researchers finally contacted Koga's family and provided information about his crash site and burial. Japanese veterans organizations arranged for his remains to be repatriated to Japan, where he was buried with full military honors in his family's plot. William Thies never received official recognition for his role in recovering the Zero. His fight to salvage the aircraft went unrecorded in official histories. His name appears in no military citations. He returned to civilian life after the war and died in 1972 without ever speaking publicly about his contribution to the war effort. Eddie Sanders continued as a Navy test pilot throughout the war. He flew dozens of captured enemy aircraft, including Japanese bombers and German fighters. He survived the war and later worked as a commercial airline pilot. In interviews decades later, he described the captured Zero as the most important aircraft he'd ever flown. Not because it was the best, but because testing it saved more American lives than anything else he did during the war. The Zero itself, damaged beyond repair after its 1945 engine failure, was scrapped for parts. For decades, historians believed no physical trace remained. But in 1988, researchers discovered that major components had been saved. The engine, portions of the fuselage, and several control surfaces had been stored in a Navy warehouse and forgotten. Those components were eventually restored and are now on display at the Smithsonian National Air and Space Museum in Washington, D.C. You can see Koga's Zero today. The red Hinomaru roundel is still visible on the wing. The bullet holes from Dutch Harbor are still present in the fuselage. The engine that failed over Akutan Island sits beside the display, preserved exactly as it was recovered from the swamp. The Akutan Zero changed the Pacific War in ways that are difficult to quantify. How many American pilots survived because they knew not to dogfight with a Zero? How many lives were saved because the Hellcat was designed specifically to counter the Zero's strengths? How many Japanese pilots died because American tactics exploited weaknesses they didn't know existed? The numbers are impossible to calculate precisely, but aviation historians estimate that the captured Zero improved American combat effectiveness by at least 30%. That translates to thousands of American lives saved and thousands of additional Japanese aircraft destroyed, all because Tadayoshi Koga made a perfect emergency landing in an Alaskan swamp. All because William Thies fought Navy bureaucracy to recover what others called worthless wreckage. All because Eddie Sanders flew an enemy aircraft and documented exactly what made it vulnerable. The story illustrates something fundamental about warfare and intelligence. The most valuable information isn't always the most obvious. A single intact aircraft, recovered from a swamp that most officers wanted to ignore, provided more tactical intelligence than dozens of combat reports and hundreds of debriefings. Japanese commanders spent the rest of the war trying to understand why American tactics changed so dramatically in September 1942. They developed dozens of theories: new training programs, superior equipment, better pilots. They never imagined the Americans had captured an intact Zero and systematically analyzed every aspect of its performance. That's the final irony of the Akutan Zero. The aircraft that dominated Pacific skies for 8 months became the tool of its own defeat. Every strength that made it successful, its tight turning, its climb rate, its low-speed agility, became irrelevant once American pilots learned to avoid those situations and exploit the Zero's weaknesses instead. Today, when you visit the Smithsonian and see pieces of Koga's Zero on display, you're looking at one of the most consequential artifacts of World War II. Not a famous ship, not a weapon that ended battles, just a fighter plane that crashed in a swamp and taught the Americans how to win. Lieutenant William Thies was right when he circled that wreck from his PBY and recognized what he'd found. That crashed Zero sitting in a remote Alaskan swamp was worth more than a dozen battleships. He just had to convince his commanding officer that what looked like wreckage from 500 feet up was actually the key to winning the Pacific Air War. And somewhere in Japan, Tadayoshi Koga's family maintains his grave, honoring a pilot who served his country with honor. They probably don't know that his final flight, his perfectly executed emergency landing, changed the course of the war in ways he never could have imagined. His skill as a pilot, demonstrated in his last moments, gave his enemies exactly what they needed to win. The factory worker's wrench froze mid-turn as he heard the pilot's words echo across the Buffalo assembly floor. "I'm not flying that death trap." It was March 1942, and another test pilot had just walked away from the Bell P-39 Airacobra, the fifth refusal that week. The aircraft sat gleaming under the hangar lights, fresh paint still drying on its distinctive mid-engine fuselage. Everything about it looked revolutionary, from its tricycle landing gear to its nose-mounted 37mm cannon. But the men who were supposed to fly it into combat had another name for the revolutionary design. They called it the flying coffin. What made this rejection particularly devastating was the timing. America desperately needed fighters. The factories in Buffalo were running 3 shifts, 7 days a week, trying to build enough aircraft to turn the tide against Germany and Japan. Yet here was a brand new fighter that nobody wanted to fly. British pilots had tested it and cancelled their orders. The French never even received theirs before their country fell. American pilots took one look at the specifications and requested transfers to anything else. Even the manufacturer's own test pilots were starting to have second thoughts. The problem wasn't immediately obvious to someone looking at the aircraft. The P-39 was sleek, modern, and packed more firepower than almost any fighter in production. That 37mm cannon could punch through armor plate like tissue paper. The design was actually brilliant, in theory. By moving the Allison engine behind the pilot, Bell Aircraft's engineers had created perfect weight distribution and opened up space in the nose for that devastating cannon. A long drive shaft ran beneath the cockpit floor, connecting the engine to the propeller through a complex series of gears and bearings. But theory and reality had diverged catastrophically. That drive shaft created vibrations that rattled through the entire aircraft, making precision flying nearly impossible. Pilots described it as sitting on top of a washing machine, running at full speed. Worse, the engine placement meant that any mechanical failure sent metal fragments and flames directly toward the cockpit. In a conventional fighter, engine problems happened in front of you where you could see them coming. In the P-39, they happened behind you, often with no warning until fire started licking at your back. Before we continue, I'd love to know where you're watching from and what you know about the Eastern Front Air War. Drop a comment below and let me know if you'd heard about the P-39's incredible Soviet service before. And if you're enjoying these deep dives into World War II aviation history, hit that subscribe button so you don't miss the next one. These stories take serious research to get the details right, and knowing you're out there makes it all worthwhile. The aircraft's most damning flaw became apparent the moment pilots tried to climb. The Allison Phi 1710 engine, powerful at sea level, choked and wheezed above 12,000 feet. This wasn't just an inconvenience, this was a death sentence. German Messerschmitt Bf-109s cruised comfortably at 25,000 feet. Japanese Zeros operated even higher. A P-39 pilot trying to intercept enemy bombers would find himself struggling for altitude while enemy fighters dove on him from above with all the advantages of speed and position. Colonel Bruce Holloway, evaluating the P-39 for combat deployment in early 1942, wrote a scathing assessment that circulated through Army Air Force's headquarters. The aircraft is fundamentally unsuited for the high-altitude interception role for which it was designed. Its ceiling is inadequate, its rate of climb is poor above 10,000 feet, and its handling characteristics at altitude are dangerous. I cannot in good conscience recommend this aircraft for combat operations against the Luftwaffe. That assessment should have killed the program. In any rational procurement system, an aircraft that couldn't perform its intended mission would be cancelled, and the factory would retool for something more promising. But rationality had little place in wartime production. The United States was still reeling from Pearl Harbor. Factories were being built, workers were being trained, and production lines were being established. Canceling the P-39 would mean shutting down an entire manufacturing operation and starting over from scratch. The time lost would be measured in months, perhaps years. So the factories kept running. Workers in Buffalo continued riveting together airframes, installing engines and mounting weapons systems on aircraft that American and British pilots refused to fly. By the spring of 1942, hundreds of P-39s were rolling off production lines with nowhere to go. They sat in storage fields across the country, rows of unwanted fighters gathering dust, while the war raged on without them. Then came an unexpected solution. The Soviet Union, fighting desperately against the German invasion, needed aircraft. Any aircraft. Joseph Stalin had made it clear through diplomatic channels that he needed fighters, bombers, and tanks in massive quantities, and he needed them immediately. The United States, eager to support its ally and keep the Eastern Front active, began shipping military equipment through the Lend-Lease program. Among those shipments were hundreds of P-39 Airacobras that nobody else wanted. American officials privately viewed this as a way to dispose of an embarrassing mistake, while technically fulfilling their obligations to the Soviets. The thinking went something like this: send them the fighters we can't use, keep the good stuff for ourselves, and hope the Russians can find some use for them. If the P-39s proved as inadequate on the Eastern Front as they had in American hands, well, at least the loss wouldn't be American pilots. The aircraft began their journey in the most roundabout way imaginable. They were loaded onto cargo ships in American ports, sailed through U-boat-infested waters to Persian Gulf ports, then disassembled and transported overland through Iran into southern Russia. The journey took months. Many aircraft were damaged in transit. Some were lost to German submarines. But by late 1942, the first P-30s were arriving at Soviet air bases, where they received a reception very different from what they had experienced in America. Soviet pilots approached the Airacobra without preconceptions or prejudices. They didn't care about high-altitude performance because they weren't fighting at high altitude. The air war over the Eastern Front was brutal, chaotic, and conducted primarily below 10,000 feet. German Stukas dive-bombed Soviet positions at low level. Soviet Sturmovix attacked German tanks at treetop height. The desperate, swirling dogfights that characterized Eastern Front combat happened in the thick air, where the P-39's Allison engine performed beautifully. The first Soviet units to receive the Airacobra treated it as an experiment. Pilots accustomed to flying the Leg-3, a wooden fighter that was underpowered and poorly armed, found the P-39 to be a revelation. That 37mm cannon could destroy a German bomber with a single well-placed shot. The aircraft's sturdy construction meant it could absorb battle damage that would have torn apart the fragile Leg-3s. And in the low-altitude environment where Soviet pilots operated, the P-39 was actually faster and more maneuverable than many German fighters. Senior Lieutenant Grigory Rechkalov was among the first Soviet pilots to fly combat missions in the Airacobra. His initial assessment, filed in October 1942, revealed the cultural differences in how pilots evaluated aircraft. The American machine is heavy but solid. It does not climb well, but it dives like a stone. The cannon is magnificent. Today, I destroyed a Junkers Ju-88 with 3 shells. The entire tail section separated from the fuselage. This aircraft rewards aggression and punishes hesitation. That philosophy, aggression rewarded and hesitation punished, became the foundation of Soviet Airacobra tactics. Pilots learned to use the aircraft's strengths while avoiding situations that exposed its weaknesses. They attacked swiftly from advantageous positions, fired that devastating cannon, and broke away before enemy fighters could respond. In the hands of pilots who understood its capabilities, the P-39 transformed from flying coffin to lethal predator. The pilot who truly mastered the Airacobra was Alexander Ivanovich Pokrishkin, a name that would become legendary in Soviet aviation history. Born in 1913 in Novosibirsk, Pokrishkin had started the war flying obsolete Y-16 fighters, struggling against superior German aircraft with outdated equipment and tactics. When he transitioned to the P-39 in early 1943, he immediately recognized its potential. Pokrishkin developed a tactical system specifically designed around the Aerocobra's capabilities. He called it the Formula for Air Combat, a methodical approach that emphasized altitude advantage, speed management, and precise gunnery. His pilots would patrol at medium altitude, around 15,000 feet, watching for German formations below. When they spotted targets, they would dive, building tremendous speed, close to point-blank range, fire a brief burst from the 37mm cannon, then zoom, climb away, using their momentum before enemy fighters could react. The tactic was devastatingly effective. Pokrishkin's personal score began climbing rapidly. 5 kills, then 10, then 20. By the time the Battle of Kursk erupted in July 1943, he was the Soviet Union's leading ace, and his unit flying American-built Aerocobras was one of the most effective fighter regiments in the Red Air Force. German pilots began recognizing his radio call sign and warning each other when Pokrishkin was airborne. Achtung, Pokrishkin in der Luft became a common transmission on German frequencies. The Battle of Kursk demonstrated the P-39's capabilities on a massive scale. German forces launched their final major offensive on the Eastern Front, committing thousands of tanks and aircraft in an attempt to encircle and destroy Soviet forces near the city. The Luftwaffe deployed its best units, expecting to achieve air superiority quickly. Instead, they encountered Soviet fighter regiments equipped with P-39s, flown by pilots who had spent months perfecting their tactics. During the first week of the battle, Pokrishkin's regiment claimed over 100 German aircraft destroyed. His personal tally for July 1943 reached 23 confirmed kills. The German offensive, which had counted on air superiority to protect ground forces, found itself constantly harassed by Soviet fighters that appeared, struck, and vanished before the Luftwaffe could respond effectively. The P-39's heavy armament proved particularly effective against German Ju-87 Stuka dive bombers, which were slow and vulnerable to the cannon's devastating firepower. Reports of the P-39's success on the Eastern Front began filtering back to American intelligence agencies by mid-1943. The assessments were initially met with disbelief. The same aircraft that American pilots had rejected as unsuitable for combat was reportedly one of the most effective fighters in Soviet service. Some analysts dismissed the reports as Soviet propaganda, designed to make their American allies feel better about sending obsolete equipment. But the evidence was overwhelming. Soviet requests through Lend-Lease channels specifically asked for more P-39s. Not P-51 Mustangs, not P-47 Thunderbolts, but more of the supposedly inadequate Aerocobras. By 1944, the Soviet Union was receiving thousands of P-39s, and Soviet aces were using them to compile scores that rivaled the best American and British pilots. Pokrishkin would end the war with 59 confirmed kills, all achieved in American-built fighters, primarily the P-39. The reason for this dramatic difference in performance came down to operational environment and tactical philosophy. American fighter doctrine in 1942 emphasized high-altitude bomber escort and interception. The P-39 had been designed for exactly that role, and it failed miserably. Soviet doctrine emphasized low-altitude ground attack and tactical air superiority. For that mission, the P-39 was nearly perfect. The same characteristics that made it unsuitable for one type of warfare made it ideal for another. Back in the United States, Bell Aircraft's engineers were absorbing lessons from the P-39's contradictory reputation. The aircraft's failures had exposed critical design flaws, but its successes had validated certain innovative concepts. The tricycle landing gear, initially controversial, proved far superior to conventional tail-dragging designs. It provided better visibility during takeoff and landing, reduced ground loop accidents, and made the aircraft easier for inexperienced pilots to handle. The company began work on an improved version, designated the P-63 King Cobra. This aircraft retained the P-39's basic layout, but featured a more powerful engine, improved aerodynamics, and modifications based on combat feedback from Soviet pilots. The P-63 would never see significant American combat service, but like its predecessor, it would be shipped to the Soviet Union in large numbers and prove highly effective in Soviet hands. More importantly, the lessons learned from the P-39's design influenced the next generation of American fighters. The tricycle landing gear became standard on virtually all subsequent American aircraft. The emphasis on pilot visibility, which Bell had pioneered with the P-39's car door-style cockpit entry, became a priority in fighter design. The concept of mounting heavy, slow-firing weapons in the nose, validated by the P-39's success with its 37mm cannon, influenced armament choices for years to come. When Lockheed's Clarence Kelly Johnson began designing America's first operational jet fighter, the P-80 Shooting Star, in 1943, the aircraft that emerged bore striking similarities to the P-39's layout. Both featured tricycle landing gear for improved handling. Both emphasized pilot visibility and ease of maintenance. Both placed the engine behind the pilot, though in the P-80, this was necessitated by jet engine design rather than a desire to mount a nose cannon. The P-80 represented everything the P-39 had tried to be but couldn't quite achieve, taking the good ideas while eliminating the flaws. The connection between the despised P-39 and America's jet-age success wasn't coincidence. It was evolution, driven by hard lessons learned from both failures and successes. The P-39's failure at high altitude forced American engineers to understand the critical importance of engine supercharging and performance across the entire operational envelope. Its success in Soviet hands taught that there was no single definition of an effective fighter aircraft. Mission requirements, operational environment, and tactical doctrine all influenced what made a design successful. Alexander Pokrishkin, the Soviet ace who had mastered the P-39, ended the war with 59 confirmed victories, making him the second highest-scoring Allied ace after Ivan Kozhedub's 62 kills. He was awarded the Hero of the Soviet Union 3 times, the highest honor the nation could bestow. In his post-war memoirs, he wrote extensively about the Airacobra, describing it as the finest fighter he had ever flown. The American machine taught me everything important about air combat. It rewarded skill and punished mistakes. It gave me the tools to survive and the weapons to destroy my enemies. More than 4,700 P-39s were delivered to the Soviet Union during the war, representing nearly half of all Airacobras produced. Soviet pilots flew them from Stalingrad to Berlin, racking up thousands of victories against the Luftwaffe. These were the same aircraft that American and British pilots had rejected as unsuitable for combat. The same flying coffins that test pilots had refused to fly. In Soviet hands, they became instruments of victory. The production lines in Buffalo finally shut down in August 1944 after producing 9,584 P-39s in various configurations. The workers who had built them probably never knew the full story of how their aircraft had performed in combat. They had read the negative reports from American pilots, heard the criticisms, and understood that the fighters they were building were considered failures by their own military. They couldn't have known that on the Eastern Front, those same fighters were helping turn the tide of the largest land war in history. By 1950, the P-39 had disappeared almost entirely from military service. Jets had taken over completely, rendering propeller-driven fighters obsolete, except in limited roles. Most Airacobras were scrapped. Their aluminum melted down for other uses. A few survived in museums, preserved as examples of wartime technology. But the aircraft's influence lived on in every American fighter that followed, carrying forward the lessons learned from both its failures and its unexpected successes. The story of the P-39 Airacobra challenges comfortable narratives about technological progress and military superiority. It reveals that success and failure are often context-dependent, that the same design can be both inadequate and excellent, depending on how it's employed. It demonstrates that innovation sometimes comes from unexpected sources, and that the path to progress is rarely straight or predictable. American aviation designers, who initially mocked the P-39's unconventional layout, later adopted many of its features in their jet fighters. Soviet pilots who received the aircraft as cast-offs from their American allies transformed it into one of the war's most effective weapons. The lessons from this contradiction shaped American aviation for decades, teaching engineers that brilliance and failure often coexist in the same design, separated only by how and where that design is used. The engineers at Bell Aircraft, who had designed the P-39 with such high hopes, never intended to create a controversial failure that would find redemption in Soviet service. They had envisioned an innovative fighter that would dominate aerial combat with its unprecedented firepower and revolutionary layout. When American pilots rejected their creation, calling it a flying coffin, it must have been devastating. Yet their design choices, even the ones that failed, contributed to the foundation of American jet aviation. The factory workers in Buffalo, who riveted together thousands of P-39s, knowing their product was unwanted by their own military, demonstrated a different kind of courage. They maintained quality and craftsmanship even when building aircraft that their own pilots called death traps. They kept the production lines running when conventional wisdom suggested the program should be canceled. Their dedication ensured that when the Soviets needed fighters desperately, aircraft were available to send them. Today, the few surviving P-39s sit in museums alongside Mustangs, Thunderbolts, and other celebrated fighters of World War II. Museum placards typically describe it as an unsuccessful design that found unexpected success in Soviet service. That assessment, while accurate, misses the deeper significance of the aircraft's story. The P-39 represents something more fundamental than success or failure in combat. It represents the messy, complicated reality of technological development, where failures teach lessons just as valuable as successes. The fighter that nobody wanted ended up teaching American aviation designers everything they needed to know about building the world's finest aircraft. Its flaws exposed critical gaps in understanding. Its unexpected success in Soviet hands demonstrated that design requirements must match operational reality. Its innovative features, refined and improved, became standard elements of jet fighter design. The flying coffin became the foundation for American air superiority in the jet age. When the North American F-86 Sabre, America's premier jet fighter of the Korean War era, took to the skies in 1947, it carried DNA from the despised P-39. The tricycle landing gear that made ground handling safe and predictable. The emphasis on pilot visibility and cockpit ergonomics. The understanding that fighter design required careful balance between competing requirements. These weren't abstract principles. They were hard-won lessons, purchased with the embarrassment of rejection and the unexpected glory of Soviet victories. The story of the P-39 Airacobra reminds us that history's judgments are rarely simple or final. The aircraft dismissed as America's worst fighter contributed more to American aviation development than many celebrated designs. The flying coffin that pilots refused to fly enabled Soviet pilots to achieve scores rivaling the war's greatest aces. The failure that should have been cancelled taught lessons that shaped the future of aerial combat. Sometimes the machines we reject teach us more than the ones we embrace, and sometimes the worst becomes the foundation for the best.